All right, hello everyone and welcome. It's funny, sometimes you look at an old family document, maybe an Ellis Island manifest, and you see a country listed that just isn't there anymore. Well, today, we're going to pull on the thread of one of those labels, Austria Hungary. We're going to uncover how this one little bureaucratic stamp on an immigration form not only buried countless family stories, but, and this is the wild part, actually helped spark a revolution from thousands of miles away. Let's get right into it.
So, let me just start with this question. What if the country on your great-grandfather's papers wasn't a real country at all? What if it was just a fiction, a convenient label that hid way more than it ever revealed? That is the historical detective story we are diving into today. Okay, picture this. It's 1905. You're on a pier in New York City. A ship's purser is scribbling away, filling out a manifest, and he gets to column 10, nationality. And it's right there, in that little box, that our source says the truth vanished. All the rich, complex stories, the different languages, the deep-seated loyalties, all of it just, poof, flattened into two simple words, Austria Hungary.
And this slide just lays it out so perfectly. You've got four men standing on that dock, a Slavic shepherd, a Magyar steelworker, a Czech brewer, and a clerk from Vienna. These guys have nothing in common. Not their language, not their religion, not their politics. They couldn't even have a conversation with each other. And yet, to the guy with the clipboard, they were all exactly the same thing. Just another body stamped with that one totally misleading label.
So, this brings us to our first big idea here, the lie of the label. And for anybody today who's trying to trace their family tree, that little stamp on an old document is like hitting a brick wall. It points you to a country you can't find on a map, and it completely erases the real identity of the person who carried it.
So what even was this place? Well, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, also called the dual monarchy, wasn't really a nation in the way we think of France or Germany. It's better to think of it like a massive, kind of awkward business merger. It was a political corporation, right? A deal between two ruling families that held together this wild patchwork of a dozen different ethnic groups, all of whom basically tolerated each other at best.
And then, when these immigrants got to America, that already blurry label got even simpler and a lot uglier. All these incredibly distinct peoples, the Slovaks, the Czechs, the Hungarians, the Croats, they all got mashed together under one single slur, hunky. And it wasn't just an insult, you have to understand. It was an economic category. It was the brand name for the strong backs that were about to fuel America's Industrial Revolution. But why did millions of people leave in the first place? What was so bad that they'd cross an ocean for an unknown future? Well, they were escaping what our source calls a pressure cooker, a system where just immense, crushing force was coming at them from every single direction. So let's take a look at what was turning up the heat.
It all started with the land itself. The source gives us this fantastic German term Zwergwirtschaft, which translates to a dwarf holding. And this wasn't some romantic family farm. No, this was a mathematical cage. It was a simple, brutal equation. The plot of land was just too small to grow enough food to feed the family that was working it, period. And this shows you exactly how it happened. It was this vicious cycle. The law said you had to divide your land equally among all your sons. But with each generation, there were more sons, and the land got sliced into smaller and smaller pieces. We're talking about strips of land so narrow a farmer could literally be standing in the middle of his own property and reach out and touch his neighbor's wheat on both sides. It was a guaranteed path to debt, and eventually losing the land altogether.
And if the slow economic starvation wasn't bad enough, the state demanded its pound of flesh too. First, it took your sons for 3 years of mandatory military service, where all the commands were in German, a language most of them didn't speak. Then, in the Hungarian part of the empire, you had this policy of Magyarization, which was a systematic attempt to just erase local languages like Slovak from all schools and public offices.
So you see, leaving wasn't just about finding a paycheck. As our source puts it so beautifully, it became an act of cultural preservation. The peasant realized the only way to save his language, his faith, his very identity from being crushed, was to pack it all up in a trunk and ship it to a place like Pittsburgh or Cleveland.
Okay, so they survive the journey, they get to America, and what happens? Well, they aren't sorted by where they came from or what they believed. They were sorted by the cold, brutal logic of the American industrial machine, which really only cared about one thing: how strong was your back?
And this created a kind of industrial caste system. You had two basic tracks. The Slovaks and Hungarians, they were funneled into what the source calls the furnace,
the hottest, dirtiest, most dangerous jobs you can imagine. The Czechs and German-speaking Austrians, who were more likely to be literate or have a trade, they got sorted to the bench. It was still hard exploited labor, for sure, but it wasn't the pure brute force of the furnace.
And I mean, when we say the conditions in the furnace were hellish, that is not an exaggeration. Get this. The job of a coke cleaner in an oil refinery meant you had to crawl inside these giant stills that were often still over 200 degrees Fahrenheit. The only way to survive the heat was to wear layers of heavy wools soaked in water. It's an unbelievable image of how disposable these men were considered.
And what did you get for 10 or 12 hours of that kind of backbreaking, life-threatening work? $1.50. $1.50 a day. And you have to understand, that number wasn't calculated for a family to get ahead. It was calculated for bare-bones survival, with absolutely zero room for getting sick or injured or just having a bad week.
So, faced with this brutal new world, what do? How do you even survive? Well, you don't look to the company, and you certainly don't look to the government for help. You build your own world. You build fortresses to protect not just your culture, but your very lives.
And the cornerstone of that fortress was this brilliant idea, the national parish. See, instead of a church being for everyone in a neighborhood, these churches were organized by language. So you'd have the Polish church, the Slovak church, the Lithuanian church. It was like a little franchise of the homeland. And the most important part? Because the immigrants paid for the bricks and mortar themselves, they owned it. They had control.
And the source gives us this incredibly powerful image of just how deep that investment ran. When they would lay the cornerstone for a new church, the men would come up and throw their old coins from the empire, feelers and kreuzers, into the wet cement. They were literally burying the currency of their oppression in the foundation of their future.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Not everyone built their community around the church. You see this major split. For the Slovaks and Hungarians, the parish was everything. But many of the Czechs were fiercely secular. They called themselves freethinkers. And instead of churches, they built Sokol halls. These were basically gymnasiums that became their secular parishes, centered on reason, physical fitness, and Czech nationalism. No religion required. And they didn't stop there. They built a whole ecosystem of survival. The fraternal lodges were like a private social security system. You paid your dues, and you got sick pay and, most importantly, burial insurance. The saloon wasn't just a bar. It was the bank, the post office, the place you went to get a job. And the immigrant newspapers in their own languages acted like a nervous system, connecting all these little colonies across the country.
Okay, and this is where the story takes its most mind-blowing turn. All of this community organizing, which started from the very simple human desire to have a decent funeral, would eventually grow into something that no one could have ever predicted. A full-blown revolution, funded right from the factory floors of America.
I mean, just look at this evolution. It starts in the 1890s with a dime a week for burial insurance. So simple, but all those dimes start to add up. By the 1900s, these lodges are acting like shadow banks, holding millions in capital. And then, by the 1910s, with World War I on the horizon, all that money transforms again. It becomes a war chest, aimed at literally redrawing the map of Europe.
And this was real. This wasn't just talk. The Slovak League launched what they called a $1 million drive. The Czechs called theirs a revolution tax. You had intellectuals like Tomáš Masaryk touring the steel towns of Pennsylvania, pitching the idea of a brand new country, Czechoslovakia, to the very same men who had fled the empire's oppression. The dimes of coal miners and steelworkers became the venture capital for a new nation. It's just incredible. You know, a story like this really forces you to rethink how history gets made. We always focus on the big halls of power, the capitals, the battlefields, but this whole episode makes you stop and ask a different question. How many nations, how many new futures were quietly born not in Vienna or Budapest, but in the smoky backrooms of saloons and the dusty union halls of industrial America? What a thing to think about.